Oh, gosh, that's bright. Well, thank you very much for, I think, a fantastic start to the day, and I'm glad to see so much audience participation and energy, because we're going to be asking you to take part in some more engagement with us, and in particular responding to a series of polls that you'll find in the app, and we'll be looking to see your reaction and kind of reacting to that and prompting some questions. I mean, you follow a wide-ranging debate, and I think we've got the main course now, really. DB funding, where's the code heading, and really your chance to, well, all of us, to put David on the spot about the regulator's plans. I think we'll all have not been out too late and kind of at home studying the pension schemes bill last night, poring over every clause, nook and cranny. But now, one of those big items was the DB funding code, and it's a chance for us to kind of dive into it and have a discussion. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jenny Condron, who is chair of the ACA and also chief actuary at Mercer in your sort of day job. With Rob Orr, who's head of technical and comms at SAUL, and David, who I think you all know is director of regulatory policy. That's it. I know there's a long job titles at there. So at the regulator. Yeah. Let us kick off. And David, what are your plans?
I mean, the excitement of a debate straight into the excitement of a new funding code. But why have a new funding code at all? What's kind of wrong with the last one? And the pensions white paper a few years ago said actually the funding regime is pretty much working as it should. But we do have a challenge that some people abuse flexibilities that are in the system. Some people struggle to understand what we mean by prudent. But also the landscape is changing. A lot of DB schemes closed in the 80s and the 90s. They're now beginning to mature. So the youngest people in those schemes are probably in their late 40s and 50s. And probably more than half DB schemes are now cash flow negative. So you put those things together, and if actually a scheme is paying out full benefits, it's cash flow negative, it's in deficit, then the gearing effect on the employer becomes really unsustainable. So we have to do something, given the maturity of schemes, around changing the pace of funding. So we have to do that. We have to deal with the fact that some people abuse the flexibilities in the system. But we also have the challenge that when I go round, probably half the people say, why don't you just tell us what you want us to do? Just tell us how much money you want to put into the pension scheme, tell us how long we've got to pay it off, and we'll just do whatever you want to. Just prescribe what we want. And then the other half, and it tends to be probably the larger pension schemes, say we love the flexibility that's in the system. It enables us to adapt what we do in terms of funding to our particular needs. So the challenge for us is how do you produce something which is more prescribed, which has less flexibility, but still allowing those people who want flexibility to do it. And so what we're proposing to do is introduce two ways, if you like, of complying with funding. One we'll call fast track and the other bespoke. So fast track, we will set what we expect people to do by the time that they reach their kind of state of maturity, if you like. So what we want is schemes to get to a low dependency on their sponsoring employer by the time that they are mature. And you'll look in the pensions bill, and we've kind of talked about schemes achieving a long-term objective. You won't find those words in the pensions bill. It talks about a funding and investment strategy by a prescribed time. But for shorthand, we'll just call that a long-term objective. So under the fast-track approach, we'll describe what that looks like, a low-dependency approach, probably based on gilts plus a quarter or gilts plus 0.5% in terms of discount rate, and other assumptions flowing around that. So we're not saying that schemes have got to do that tomorrow. We're saying by the time they reach maturity, and we'll consult on what we mean by maturity, they'll have reached that. And the further they are away from that point of maturity, the more risk they can do. But we'll prescribe a basis by which they determine whether the fund's in surplus or deficit. Once you have that, we'll prescribe a period which we think is reasonable, and we'll probably consult about whether that should vary by covenant grade, but we'll prescribe a period over which we'd expect a deficit to be paid off. And then we'll also say, actually, we don't want you to take unsustainable risk in your investment strategy. So there'll be a test which we'll consult on to see whether there's an excessive amount of investment risk. So actually, if schemes want to go down the fast track route, we'll kind of help them by prescribing a lot of what we expect. And then actually they'll get very little regulatory scrutiny, so they won't get hordes of people from Brighton descending on them and challenge what they're doing. So we hope that schemes will find that an attractive route to go down, requires much less involvement from us. But for those schemes that really value flexibility, there will be a bespoke route. They'll be able to vary their recovery plan, take more investment risk, but we'll expect them to justify that to us, to make sure that the risk that they're taking is sustainable. So on the one hand, we've got a prescribed approach, we've got a more flexible approach, and obviously for the schemes that go down that flexible approach, we will look at what they're doing in much more detail. They will face some scrutiny, some challenge from us, but that's a perfectly acceptable way to comply with what we want. So those are the kind of headlines of where we are.
Okay, thanks, David. And I mean, I'm sure it'll come up as a question. Just for context, how might that prescribed approach overlap with some of the extra supervision that some members of the audience may have been through?
Well, for those schemes that are subject to relationship supervision, we're not just looking at funding. I mean, that is part of it if it's a DB scheme. But the schemes that are under one-to-one supervision are public schemes, DC schemes, and DB schemes. And we're looking at the overall level of governance, the way the scheme is run, whether they've got the right checks and controls in place. So those will still happen, but if they choose to go down the fast-track route, then we won't challenge them in terms of what they're doing on funding and investment as much.
Okay. So I think we've got a chance to open up for a mini consultation now. Fingers at the ready. Let's bring up our first question.
Should say we have something like 5,600 defined benefit pension schemes, so it'd be very helpful for us in terms of resources if a number of schemes did go down the fast track route. So I'm very keen to understand what you're going to say in response to this.
Okay, are the results ready to come in? Okay, it looks a little bit like some of the debate earlier, that there's some polarization of views.
And that's, I mean, it's not surprising. The critical thing for me is what will the detail look like? If fast track sets a very high bar with relatively short recovery plans and high cash funding as a consequence, even though you might want to go through a low-cost approach, a sausage machine, not pay advisor fees and actually focus on spending your money on improving benefit security, all of which is great. It's no good if you fall out of the prescribed detail and fail.
Yep.
So none of us have got any of the detail on what that fast track position looks like. Go on.
Rob?
Well, I work for an open DB scheme. I think that actually the fast track approach will probably be quite attractive for smaller schemes who don't have limitless resources to jump through regulatory hoops. It'll probably also be quite attractive for employers that want to take on a bit less regulatory scrutiny. I can see some attraction there. I think for me there seems to be a slight tension between a funding approach that is scheme specific and a sort of fast track direction of travel which is a bit more standardised, and for the moment I can't quite see how those two mesh together at the moment. But I'm sure when we get the consultation, we'll see some of the detail around that.
And it's interesting there, the second response, because it's probably fair to say that it is the smaller schemes who come to us and say, just tell us what to do. We don't want to spend money on advisors. So that is the sort of reaction we were expecting of fast track may be very attractive for smaller schemes.
David, on the fast track approach, the scheme funding statement that came out in the early or late spring, kind of hinted at 7 years was the sort of max recovery plan you were aiming for. I appreciate bespoke might lead you to a bit more kind of flex. Is that where people might be sort of, if you're thinking about this now, that's where the fast track's going to kind of push you?
So we're actually going to do 2 consultations. The first one around the principles, and then the second one much more around the detail. And it's in the second one that we will tie those sorts of things down quite tightly. And alongside that, we will publish an impact statement. So, to Jenny's point of, if it going down fast track requires you to pay a lot more over a much shorter period, then people will not go down that. So clearly we have to design the fast track route so that it's accessible to quite a few schemes. In terms of 7 years, the reason we said we sort of expect stronger employers to aim for that. Actually, most strong employers do actually have recovery periods of less than 7 years. There are a few outliers. But we get quite challenged that we look at funding plans and the employer says, I'm really, really strong and therefore I can have a much more optimistic funding basis. I'm a really, really strong employer and so I can actually have a really long recovery plan. And I'm a really strong employer so I can take lots of risk in my investment strategy. And when we say, well, actually, we'd like you to pay a bit more over a shorter period, they say, well, I can't afford that. And you say, well, hang on a minute, you're claiming that you're a really strong employer to get the kind of lowest possible contribution rate, but actually, are you genuinely a strong employer? So, we were saying to people in the annual funding statement, look, if you are a genuinely strong employer, surely you can pay off your deficit in a shorter period than the average pension scheme.
So just picking up one point, for me, fast track needs to be unambiguous. If you're a sponsor and a set of trustees who say, I can tick all these boxes with fast track, the last thing we can have is that you then fail when it starts to be examined within TPR. And the point that concerns me, that perhaps starts to pick up on a couple of questions' time, is if I can decide what my covenant strength is in determining my recovery plan, many will say that they are at the strongest end, and TPR's perspective may be at the opposite end of the spectrum. And so what the valuation I think I've concluded, actually, once it gets to TPR, it's rejected. And that doesn't feel like success or fast track.
And I think that's a reasonable challenge. And one of the questions we'll ask in the consultation is, should covenant be part of the fast track route? We have been working over the last year with a panel of 9 experts, and within fast track we said to them, well, actually, if you're a struggling employer and struggling financially, should you have a longer period to pay off any deficit? And the response that we got from the panel of experts is, well, actually, companies will argue that, at the moment they're arguing that they're stronger than they potentially are, because that means they pay lower contributions over a longer period. Actually, if we introduce that into fast track, people might argue that they're not as strong as actually they are, and people will try and manipulate the system. So it is a genuine question of, actually, should we take covenant into account in those circumstances and just give a very simple approach, which is the same for every company. So we'd be very interested in response to that.
Conscious we've got quite a lot of questions, quite a few more questions to get through. So let's move to our second question. David, maybe you can think about that 3% that don't want to talk to you at all.
Can we tell who they are?
Maybe we'll come to them at the end. Okay, let's see how this one responds to. So can you just check, David, on timing? What's your kind of outlook looking like? Is it published soonish, depending on the bill, and then how long might it run for?
That's one of those really difficult questions, because we have got potentially Brexit on the horizon. We may have a general election. So probably if we didn't have those things, we'd probably publish very soon. We'd always intended to publish shortly after the bill was introduced into the House. Just where we are politically, I'm not quite sure, frankly, what the right time to publish and start the consultation will be. We're sort of thinking now, maybe in January next year, and when things may just have settled down. But it's a movable feast.
Yeah, fingers crossed. We'll see how the weekend goes. Okay, let's have a look at the results. Wow, that's got a lot of polarisation there. Right, Rob, since I cut you off, do you want to go first?
I think I can see a lot of merit for schemes that are closed on our legacy, that actually de-risking is the right way to go. I see a lot of merit in that. I think for open schemes, there may well be a concern about the cost of ongoing DB accrual, and I don't think we want to get into a place where actually the code pushes that up to such a degree it becomes unaffordable and schemes end up closing. I don't think that's a good outcome.
And that's not one of your objectives, is it, David?
No, it's not. And you know, we are in a position where the majority of DB schemes are closed, both to new entrants and to future accrual. And as I say, they're beginning to mature quite rapidly now. But within this funding standard, we don't want to introduce something which is going to incentivise those schemes that are currently open to close. It is something that we're very conscious of, but it's striking the right balance between protection of members' accrued rights with also giving some flexibility in terms of open schemes and not putting an undue burden on them. So again, that's an area that we're really interested in feedback of whether we've got that balance right between protection and affordability.
So the bit, as a scheme actuary, I've been trying to work out, and which I got some clarity on in a session that the regulator held with the ACA last night, was, okay, so we have to fund to technical provisions. These long-term objectives are out here. How can we get employers to fund for that gap? Is that what you're saying, that you'll go beyond technical provisions? And the clarification was that technical provisions under this approach will gradually step towards your long-term objective. So fine. So I now understand that I've got to get fully funded on technical provisions, but technical provisions is a moving feast that gradually heads towards this more secure, less dependency on the sponsor position. Fine, understand that. We've got many schemes that are doing this already. So the time frame might not be as short as TPR might like. But actually, I think for many in the room, you already have a plan to get to a long-term objective. That said, and thinking of some of my clients, I've got some which are really stuck, whose technical provisions will never get towards a lower risk place. And actually getting those trustees and sponsors sometimes to understand that getting to full funded on technical provisions is not the end of the journey, is really hard. So this may well help unlock some of those conversations as an advisor. It's interesting, the split of answers.
I mean, we do see already a lot of schemes with already got long-term objectives, and they've got really strong journey plans on the way there. Those schemes that do have those things in place, from our point of view, have got much better governance, much better risk management, and we tend not to have to challenge those schemes as much. So what we're saying is the best practice that some of you out there are already doing, we'd just like more people to do that, and that's behind the pensions bill saying let's everybody have a long-term objective, let everybody have a journey plan in place on how they're going to get there.
Okay. Whilst we look at the next question, I'm going to ask you, David, a question that's come up on the app. Will you be comparing and people go through the fast track process, they set various criteria, they meet the criteria that you put out. Will you then be comparing where that kind of scheme population ends up versus the bespoke people, or because you could end up potentially with a differential emerging, which creates a two-tier system that you kind of hadn't thought about?
I suppose we'll probably do it the other way round. So if people go down the fast track route, we're sort of guiding them by the time that they reach a point of maturity that they'll have low dependency on their sponsoring employer. So that's a kind of a glide path, if you like, which we're quite comfortable with. It may be that some schemes choose to go down the fast track route, and actually they're further de-risked or much closer to being less dependent on the employer than perhaps they would need to be on the fast track. But for people who choose bespoke, if people are being prudent, it's prudent relative to what? So people go down the bespoke route, we'll sort of say, well, actually, how far away are they from the fast track route? So if they're taking more investment risk, we'll say, well, how much risk is that compared to fast track? Are they a strong employer? Can they actually increase contributions if that investment strategy doesn't work out? So that's the kind of the benchmark that we'll be looking at.
Okay, and we had a lot of debate about kind of covenants and cases of employers collapsing and putting that at risk over the last couple of years. I mean, it'll be interesting to see what the results are on how people think about how long you can have a look at covenant and take a proper account of it. So let's bring up the results and see where we are. Okay. So, Jenny, do you want to?
I don't disagree. I've seen a board of trustees effectively let the company off the hook with a very weak funding basis, and within a matter of years, the covenant had gone completely. And so I absolutely, to the first answer, even strong employers' covenants can disappear faster than you can possibly imagine. The jigsaw piece that's missing for me is, what does this mean in terms of what I can allow for in either setting my recovery plan, in requiring contingent assets to support it? We need to understand what this means in practice.
Yeah.
I think for me, I can see an argument where there's some sectors and some pension schemes where actually they can have a longer term visibility on covenant, and actually it can go beyond 3 or 5 years for some sectors. I suppose there's also an argument, yes, it can weaken overnight, but of course it can go the other way and it can strengthen overnight. And so I think it's important to remember that. I also think there's something here about integrated risk management, and remembering that covenant is one component, but you've also got funding and investment, and you just need to think about how all those things work together.
Yeah, okay. Let's bring up the next question. David, if you could pick up how all of this fits into the IRM regime, and I know that we're adding more and more kind of acronyms into the system as we go. How does this all kind of stitch together from your perspective?
Well, I suppose when we see covenant reports, they tend to say, this company is absolutely strong for the next 3 or 4 years. We're not quite sure, but we think it'll probably be okay in 3 to 6 years, and beyond 6 years, we really don't know how the company will fare. And that's then really challenging when you've got something like a 12-year recovery plan of how can you rely on the company funding those contributions over that period if you don't have sight. So we're thinking that actually, you start a valuation, you assume the covenant is strong if that's what the covenant advisor tells you, but you allow for some tailing off of strength in time. Then in 3 years' time, when you do the next valuation, actually if experience says the company is still strong, then you kind of stretch that out a bit further. But what we're saying is actually, even as Jenny was saying, even really strong companies can have something come in left field that can knock them off course. And it's just really sensible to have a plan of, if the sponsoring employer loses a contract or something hits their business, do they have a contingent plan for how they're going to deal with that? And that just seems like sensible planning, and that's what integrated risk management is all about.
Okay, so obviously recovery plans, whenever we look at DB funding in any sense, is one of those kind of topics that kind of is front and centre of the whole debate. So it'd be interesting to see where people are here, and obviously some of that plays into the conversations we've just had. I mean, Rob, are you worried that schemes are suddenly going to be, your recovery plan is going to be very different, especially as we kind of head into potentially turbulent economic circumstances?
I worry about lots of things. But I think that the key for deficit recovery contributions is actually they do need to be reasonably affordable. I don't think you can argue with that at all. I think the other point, which will be interesting if it's teased out in the code, is how other assets for employers are taken into account, so parental guarantees and charges over assets and that sort of thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that's all teased out in the code.
Okay. Jenny?
We see what the answers.
Yeah, let's see the answers.
Yeah. Okay. So strong support for just dealing with the problem, and that I see it with some companies who don't have DB liabilities, who contrast their commerciality against schemes that are lumbered with a legacy DB scheme that is a drain on cash, and it stops them from doing other things that they would dearly love to do. So actually, for many, just dealing with the problem, great, get on with it. There is a tension here in terms of, well, paying too much money in, and actually you can't get that back until you wind it up. And well, we actuaries put prudence into our funding bases. Maybe we're right, maybe we're wrong. But if we're wrong, it does risk too much cash being locked in the scheme for many, many years. And so this whole, yes, pay it down as quickly as you can is fair, but we've got to be open to other ways of supporting residual deficits and providing that longer term security if it exists.
Okay, can we pop up the next question? I'll ask David, you mentioned earlier, I'll give you some space to answer this particular question too. You mentioned earlier that 50% of schemes were potentially now cash flow negative. And one of the kind of big discussions we've had is, are the typical employers of DB schemes potentially more at risk from changes in the kind of economic environment, the way the economy works in terms of challenges from elsewhere? How do those kind of things factor into where you see the need to push recovery plans?
I think it's an interesting. Paul McGlone did an excellent session yesterday on schemes have been paying quite high deficit contributions, and those deficit contributions have been used to pay cash outflow, transfer values, and benefit payments. And as the schemes kind of improve their funding level and those deficit contributions cease, then actually schemes are being forced into a position where they have to sell off assets. And what we really want is schemes to plan for that, to understand what the impact is going to be on their strategy and investment returns and so on, and do that in a very considered way rather than be forced to sell assets at potentially inappropriate times. So I think it's just recognising that you're in that position, that you are going to have to sell assets, and you just need to incorporate that into your investment strategy. Just picking up on the point that Jenny raised, and we do recognise that we are encouraging sponsors to pay contributions into the scheme. It's really easy to put money into the scheme, and it's very difficult to take it back out. So within the consultation itself, we will recognise that escrow accounts, asset-backed funding structures are reasonable ways for companies to deal with the position that they don't want to be overfunded. I think it's a bit of a challenge in that some of those vehicles, those mechanisms, are readily affordable by larger pension schemes, but actually, is there a way of making those accessible for smaller schemes as well? So that is something that we're looking at, and we'll put some ideas around looking at PPF qualifying assets as things that you might want to build into your recovery plan or your funding plan.
You partly beat me to it. I was going to ask how frictionless those would be against the kind of PPF contingent assets regime, because it's been reasonably smooth, but there have been some bumps in the past. And just as we pull up the results, I'll give you 30 seconds to answer that.
So yeah, it's what we're trying to say is, look, if people are having to certify assets for the PPF, why not actually use those same things in terms of funding plan? Why put schemes to the expense of going down a different route to prove to us that those assets are reasonable when the PPF has already got a mechanism to do that?
And sorry, one final plea on recovery plans. Can we have something in the code that lets contributions stop? If I get to full funding and I've reached my long-term objective, but I still have a recovery plan, can we have more clarity about how we can actually switch the tap off if it's no longer required? And that's a great place to be.
Okay.
Okay, so looks like lots of support for people being able to kind of explain what they're doing. Let's move on to the last question.
No. We need mortality too, please, Joe. Sorry.
Okay.
Investment risk is really important, but actually, if you've hedged and if you've de-risked, we haven't got to the end of the risk game. Longevity risk is something that, as a profession, we got clobbered for not being quick enough to recognise, and it keeps oscillating, which just serves how little we actually know. We can't predict what life expectancy will be. So mortality risk may well be a bigger risk potentially for some schemes than just investment risk. And there are other assumptions too, with freedom and choice. Assuming everybody's going to take maximum tax-free cash may no longer be appropriate. So I think we need to be perhaps a little bit broader than just focusing on that one area.
Okay, a good point and a nice plea to speak to your actuary, Jenny. Well done.
My crystal ball only works so well.
Can we pop up the next question? And I just like, whilst people are looking and answering that very quickly, David, we've heard a little bit of talk about more of a kind of comply or explain in this. I mean, just can you give us a sense of a little bit more what that might feel like?
So actually, when we started thinking about this, we sort of talked about a comply and explain approach, and the comply was sort of fast track and the explain was bespoke. And the feedback we got that comply and explain makes it sound that if you go down the bespoke route, it's somehow not as good as going down the fast track route. And we really want to get across it's down to schemes to choose whether they go down fast track or whether they go down bespoke. Both of those are equally satisfactory. And we're tailoring it, if you like, to the feedback that we've had, that some people want prescription, some people want flexibility. So I'm a little bit wary of comply and explain, because it makes it sound like explain is you're not quite doing it the way that you ought to do it. Yeah. Whereas we do want to get the impression that, give the view that each approach is equally valid.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's have a look at these results. Okay, Rob, you've got an open scheme. How are you feeling about this?
Slightly nervous. I can actually see this being an area of concern for open DB schemes. And I fear slightly there's a risk that the new code will lead to a higher price for new accrual. And I think there's actually an argument for younger members who might not have their benefits payable for 20 or 30 or 40 years. Actually, there's a question as to whether that's completely appropriate. And I think it's important to keep that point in mind.
Okay.
Though, perhaps, and we were talking about this earlier, if we hold on to the concept that many technical provisions are already set up, that as schemes mature, they will head towards the long-term objective. For an open scheme, clearly that pace of maturing is going to be much, much slower. So maybe, panic not, that actually what you've got today may still be fit for purpose under this new funding code. But if you don't have enough new entrants, or people don't die quickly enough,
what a cheery thought.
Sorry, I'm an actuary. That tilt in terms of moving from an open scheme that really stays relatively immature in perpetuity to something that starts to mature and has to head towards that long-term objective, that time will only tell.
Okay, thank you. I think we might now, this is the end of the questions. So we've got lots of questions still through on the app, but let's see if anybody out there in the audience in the great beyond has got a question for any of our panel. So let's scanning up. Slightly blinded by the lights.
Prefer the
But, okay.
Yeah.
His gentleman here. Hi, Hugh.
Just to get the ball rolling, a very trivial question probably to David. Do you see a distinction between strong employers and employers with poor contributions? So, for example, have an asset base that you can draw on in extremis that don't want to realise now?
I mean, we at the moment we see all sorts of people claiming that they're strong because they think they can have weaker assumptions, longer recovery plans, and so on. And I guess there's a challenge of how you look at strong employers, and I think one of the ways might be to kind of reverse how you look at schemes, and you look at their funding plan, and you look at how much they have to put into their scheme by way of contributions. You look at their investment strategy and how much risk is built into it and what the downside risk might be. And then you say, well, actually, if they kind of had a high risk investment strategy, it doesn't pay off, can they then increase contributions to deal with adverse experience? And it's a real challenge for us when actually a lot of clients, so we do have a number of schemes which are almost wholly pensioners that are 100% invested in equities. And when you say to them, so if that doesn't quite work out, can you pay more contributions? And they say, no, I'm paying the maximum I can. That kind of doesn't feel right. So as long as schemes can actually deal with some adverse experience, then actually I think, yeah, that's how we should take it into account, whether that's through strong profitability or strong assets or however it is. Thank
you. Any more questions in the audience? Well, whilst you're finding your courage, we'll take some from the app. You've got a lot of extra stuff to do at the regulator, David, with all the supervision, master trust. Are you going to put a new wing on Trafalgar House? Well, actually, our Trafalgar House is coming up for renewal in 2023, so we're going to have to look for a new building anyway. I'm sure Charles will kill me if I said we've got all the people and thing that we need. Clearly, if DWP inclined or Treasury inclined to give us some more money to hire more people, we're not going to say no to that. But we have been going, through a transformation journey. It's something that Leslie started when she was at the regulator. So we have been changing the way that we regulate, and some of that is now very visible in terms of one-to-one supervision. But we've had to, because of automatic enrolment, deal with huge numbers of employers and make sure that they're all compliant. So we've learned a lot, if you like, by looking at how we've done automatic enrolment, the efficiencies that we've been able to drive through that. And we're now investing significantly in technology to make even the automatic enrolment compliance more efficient. So we're taking those lessons and then trying to apply them to the way we look at DB schemes and DC schemes and so on. So some of this is we're just becoming much more efficient, learning from other parts of the regulator. This new funding code, because it introduces the concept of fast track, clearly the more people that go down the fast track route, the less that we have to look at their funding plans and challenge them. And so it does mean that what we can do is shift our resources to those people who are pushing the boundaries or going beyond the boundaries that are acceptable. We can really focus on the people that are not doing what we want to, rather than kind of cause a lot of pain and expense for those people who are doing and trying to do the right things. Thank you. Just going to ask Jenny and Rob, we won't possibly find out the full details until January. When you take this sort of concept back to your clients or trustee board, what kind of reaction do you think you're going to get?
The annual funding statement was really helpful, and that gave a helicopter view of perhaps what's coming, whether it's January, yep. Joe, who knows. But that clarity in terms of 12 buckets, is that the number of different covenant groups that these are the things that you as trustees need to focus on, was really helpful. Some trustee bodies with less governance budget really struggle to engage on IRM. The whole concept is just too touchy-feely. I can't quite articulate it. So being able to sit with the detail in the annual funding statement and say, right, I think I'm in this bucket. How do I answer all of these questions? Do I feel comfortable with the answers I've given, or is there something I need to address? Actually was really helpful. So providing we carry on in that vein, I think there'll be a lot of support, but the devil is in the detail.
I think our trustee board will look at it and think, actually, we're doing a lot of these things already. We've got the equivalent of a long-term funding objective, for example, and we do stress testing and so forth. I suspect our board will also think, actually, we need a DB code that works for multi-employer schemes. So a little gentle plea to David. If it can work for multi-employer schemes, particularly really big ones, that would be very helpful, please. And I think our trustee will also look at it and think, well, let's work towards ensuring that the cost of DB accrual remains affordable. I think.
Thank you. And I'm just going to take one final question from the app, which is came up in one of the debates yesterday, actually, the sort of not the Guy Offerman show debate. So if long-term targets are official milestones, how does TPR think other regulatory bodies will expect this to be shown in their accounts and their balance sheets? Could it have unforeseen consequences or counterproductive consequences?
So, part of the discussions that we've had with our panel of 9 experts is, if we head down this road and it all appears really sensible, what are the kind of unintended consequences of some things that we might do? And when you look at the long-term objective, it has to be agreed between the trustees and the employer. And, we're conscious of the fact that employers might look at the long-term objective and say, well, actually, that's going to drive my technical provisions on the journey to the long-term objective. So actually, I think I could probably reach it in 15 years, but I'm actually going to say 20, because then that will give me a bit of leeway, and the regulator won't kind of come down on me if I kind of can't hit 15. And clearly what we want is for trustees and employers to sit down and sensibly decide what the target is that they're aiming for, and for that to be a realistic target. But we recognise that some employers will try to give themselves a bit of breathing space in terms of how they set it. So I think the onus is on us to help people in terms of setting their long-term objective, and it might be that we say, we help them say, we're aiming to achieve our long-term objective in 15 years, but only if that means that we don't have to pay more than £100 million a year into the scheme, because if we go beyond that, that becomes a significant impact on the business. So if people set their long-term objectives and they take account of some of the parameters that might drive them to say, well, it's not going to be 15 years, it's going to be 17 because we can't afford to increase our contributions, then hopefully people will be realistic. But there will always be people that will try and push the boundaries of what we're aiming for.
Thank you. We're getting to the close of the session, so I'm just going to take my sort of chair's prerogative. I think, David, what I'm hearing is this might feel quite different in many places. There's going to be some new ideas in here, potentially some new obligations for people to kind of get their heads around. But you're definitely in listening mode. Absolutely. And there is probably going to be quite some time before people feel this change in practice, given the sort of two-stage process you're thinking about with the consultation and who knows what might happen with the bill. So no sleepless nights yet, but maybe a bit later.
Well, I think 2 things. One is, as Jenny said, the annual funding statement sort of took us on a journey towards this new funding code. So actually the new funding code is a progression of what you're already seeing coming out of the regulator. But the other thing to say is for schemes that are doing all the things that Rob was saying around looking at integrated risk management, understanding all the various levers, my expectation is that those will be able to slot into the new funding code without having to do lots more work or to dramatically change what they're doing, because they're already doing all the right things. It's probably the people that could afford to pay a bit more but actually are reluctant to do it. The trustees are not getting anywhere in terms of getting what they think is the right amount of contributions. It might have much more of an impact on those type of schemes, I think.
Okay, thank you. And I'm sure for all the members in this audience, that's a reassuring message, because they're entirely going to be in the good camp.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. David and the other panellists will be, there were lots of questions still through the app we didn't get a chance to answer. We'll be about in the hall, and if you've got more questions that you want to grab them on, please do. We're now going to head into a brief refreshment break. During that time, you'll have the opportunity, we talked earlier about what good DC looks like. Please go to the Learning Hub, and there's a session there where you can hear about what that looks like, in particular some of the experiences of PQM schemes. There's also the opportunity, if you head to the PLSA stand, to meet our Director of the Policy Board and Chair of the Policy Board and Director of Policy and Research, to ask them any questions. Otherwise, I'd like to ask you to thank the panel in the usual way.